Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
40 years ago this week, Margaret Thatcher came to power. At the time, Labour leader James Callaghan described it as a sea change in politics. It does not matter what you say or what you do, he went on to explain. There is a shift in what the public wants and what it approves of. The sense at that time was of an economy and a form of politics that was broken, over powerful trade unions, politicians only capable of managing decline. There was a popular yearning for a radical break. Even Thatcher's opponents felt it. Fast forward to now, and we once again see chaotic politics, widespread sense of economic dissatisfaction. Is this another sea change moment for the UK? A 40-year itch, perhaps? In the first of a series of 3 films about the direction of the UK, our economics editor, Ben Chu, looks at the future of the world of work.
The Industrial Revolution began.
I think we are at a crossroads.
The similarity between now and 1979 is that the conditions are ripe for quite significant change.
Politics is now debating ideas again from first principles.
OK, it will be a revolution, transformative.
It's 40 years since the last big post-war political and economic watershed. If we're about to experience another one, as some believe, what will this mean for the world of work?
Going through changes, and no one knows what's going on.
This Derbyshire town epitomises the agonising growing pains of the world of work in Britain. During the 1984 miners' strike, the colliers of Derbyshire were bitterly divided over whether or not to down tools during the titanic industrial dispute with Margaret Thatcher's government. Miners had to be bussed into the Shirebrook colliery, with the police separating them from hostile pickets made up of their fellow workers.
Nearly 4 decades on, there's no longer a coal mine at the end of this street. Instead, there's a Sports Direct warehouse built on exactly the same site. This is a place that's been described as a neo-Victorian workhouse, a zero-hours gulag. It's become a symbol of what many regard as the fundamental dysfunction of the modern British workplace. So the past and the present of the UK labour market on the same street.
We'd picketed and we were walking back and they just got me, took me in this van and took me.
Of course, Sports Direct has brought thousands of jobs to town, but one former Shirebrook miner thinks work down the pit, hard and dangerous as it was preferable to toiling in the modern workplace that has been built on top of it.
You know what you're going to get paid, yeah? You know what hours you're going to work, yeah? If you're off work sick, pension scheme, whatever. You know, you signed your contract on day one, and that was it. I used to look at this place as like a mother, you know, and it looked after everybody, you know. And you got to look after mother, you know what I mean? And one of the things we like, we always liked it to be profitable.
Government's 5% policy.
Many agreed that the trade unions were too powerful in the 1970s and that Britain needed radical industrial reform to escape the grip of so-called managed decline.
Here's the cabinet.
Michael Heseltine was one of Margaret Thatcher's original ministers in 1979 and recalls the dominance of the trade unions.
It was job destructive. It was a major force of keeping this country uncompetitive. We looked inwards, we subsidised the industries, and they just didn't look to world markets. The world markets were changing, becoming competitive. We were falling further and further behind.
But did the demolition of the power of organised labour by Mrs Thatcher overshoot? Have bosses, whether in places like Sports Direct or in new digital platforms, been given too much power over ordinary workers? And have successive UK governments been too concerned with the number of jobs rather than their quality and the welfare of workers?
On the surface, the UK jobs economy looks pretty healthy. Employment is at a record high, joblessness is at its lowest since the mid-1970s. But under the surface, it's a different story. There has been a proliferation of zero-hours contracts. The gig economy is spreading fast, and there's a rising sense that the world of work is not paying like it used to, despite increases in the minimum wage.
Average wages are still below where they were a decade ago, and in-work poverty has exploded. 2 decades ago, most people in poverty were in workless households. Today, the majority of poor people have someone in the family in work. There's a feeling of growing imbalance in the labour market. The number of low-income men working part-time has grown alarmingly over the past 20 years, even as many others crave a healthier work-life balance.
Today we have nearly 4 million people on insecure and low-paid work like bogus self-employment, zero-hours contracts. Well, unions are all in favour of flexibility. You know, many of us have brought up kids and needed flexibility at work. But it has to be a two-way street. And the problem is all the power currently is in the boss's hand and workers don't have a fair voice.
The Labour and Trade
John McDonnell could be the next Chancellor of the Exchequer, charged with delivering this new world of work.
We've got a long hours economy. We work longer hours than the rest of Europe. Low productivity, you know, for German workers and French workers will produce in 4 days what we produce in 5. And I think the change that people are wanting is exactly that. They want a decent income, so that does mean basic levels of pay, you know, real living wage. It does mean the restoration of trade union rights, the return of sectoral collective bargaining, but also people are actually asking now for more of a say.
The testimony from one Sports Direct warehouse employee, who we have kept anonymous, shows just how little power some UK workers have.
I've got lots of friends that still haven't got contracts. There are many of us who have been working many years for this company and we still haven't got contracts. How can you still call someone a temporary worker after 10 years? No rights, no contract, nothing. We're asking to be treated like humans, like good workers, respect.
Could the lack of bargaining power of ordinary workers actually be holding back the entire economy? Is this one of the reasons our productivity, already well below that of peer economies such as France and Germany, has flatlined since the financial crisis? Jim O'Neill is a former Conservative Treasury Minister appointed by George Osborne.
So if you want to really solve the productivity problem, you might want to, and there's risks with it, but I think it's worth exploring, bringing back a bit more strength to the powers of labour providers relative to the employers, which people of my generation will think, ooh, but I think that's at the core of why we have some of these big problems today, in a huge contrast to 40 years ago.
But others, like the current Chief Secretary to the Treasury, say we should beware assuming state action is the answer.
I think government regulation is important, but it should be simple, it should be transparent. What I'm concerned about is people who say this can all be organised by the government. You know, we can have a committee that decides on which company should be invested in. We will decide the terms and conditions of every person who works in Britain. We'll decide how you run your business. I don't think that's the world people want to live in.
A blanket approach to this isn't likely to be very successful. So I work in the gig economy now as a retired person. I don't need union protection. And to change the law to make it more difficult for employers to recruit me, for example, would be pointless. Young people are those we need to help and find a way through. And I think that there are genuine concerns about the opportunities for young people who are brought into the labour force, essentially at very low wage rates.
So how do we help young workers? Some say we need to think about very radical policies such as a universal basic income, a jobs guarantee, or a 4-day working week. But others say we need entirely new labour market institutions.
Unions are a 19th century innovation in the labour market. What are 21st century ways in which workers are going to organise and collectivise their power? I don't know exactly what it will look like, but I would imagine it will use the technology. It will be a platform in some way. It will be able to connect lots of people who may be in very different places. And I think it will also have to involve delivering skills that people need to have that power in the labour market.
Technological advances, globalisation, and the shifting sands of personal consumer taste. These are the big impersonal forces that have always profoundly influenced what we do at work and how we do it. And they will continue to do so. But perhaps the biggest question over the future of the British workforce is the extent to which our personal choices as workers can also influence that coming world.
Theresa May wanted workers on company boards, but for some the goal should be a more comprehensive form of worker democracy. In London, at a tech startup.
So Abby, you're the boss, right?
No. Don't say that. We're all the bosses.
They argue that cooperatives, where the firm is owned and run by its workers, are the future.
Thinking about the world of work over, say, the next 50 years, can you actually envisage a world, UK, full of co-ops like you?
It's only building, basically. So we're part of a network which started off with about 23 digital co-ops in the UK, and now it's about 36.
Doesn't it mean a lot of admin, a lot more work? You know, you have to sort of take responsibility, whereas if you perhaps worked in a more traditional environment, you get told what to do, but also you don't have the headaches of being your own boss.
I think it's different work.
It's different, and I think also for me, personally, like the amount of skills that I've learned since working here, I don't think any of us ever come into a meeting or into a decision just like with one hat on. We're constantly wearing lots of different hats because we're the business owners.
I think we've got plenty of evidence to show how it's increased productivity, it's increased well-being, it's increased like a team spirit.
What's striking is how no one who thinks seriously about the future of the world of work believes stasis is even a remote possibility.
If you look at the surveys, there are a very significant number of people who actually like the flexibility of these contracts. And my guess is that tomorrow's world will bring more flexibility.
Okay, it will be revolutionary, transformative, because we're going to change society, and that's what's demanded of us now. I think most people accept that now. And we'll do it by taking people with us, but it will be done on a very pragmatic basis. And that's why I call it is common sense socialism.
We've never had a more capable, informed group of citizens in this country, you know, people who've got access to huge realms of information. And what people want, and you know, I go around the country meeting people, I'm doing a whole range of events around the spending review, people say they want to make the decisions themselves. If people decide to take a sabbatical or want to work different hours or want to work more flexibly, I think we're seeing a huge shift in the economy towards more remote working. I think that's good news actually for towns and cities across Britain.
How do we share the benefits of new technology? We know there are fantastic productivity gains to be made. We know they tot up to millions and billions of pounds. How are we going to share that out? Is it higher pay? Is it a shorter working week? Is it more satisfying work? Let's get rid of boring work. Let's get rid of the drudgery.
It may be too much to ask that work is never boring, but there seems to be an emerging political consensus that work can and should offer greater autonomy for individual workers. But how to get there? Protection, disruption, or revolution?
That was Ben Chew. Now, Sports Direct didn't respond to our request for comment on the criticisms made in that film, but we're going to take the discussion on now. Should the Conservatives today be making the case for the burning injustices of which Theresa May once spoke so eloquently, or be doubling down on the principles of the free market and the individual, which Thatcher embedded? Now, Daniel Hannan, David Willits and Faiza Shaheen are still with me. And David, I'm going to start with you again, because you'll remember the very beginning of Thatcher. You served with her. Do the Tories have to address the fact that the economy is simply not working for millions of people?
There is a challenge, and the challenge is of pay and job satisfaction. But we have now got the fact that there are 75% of people in work. We have record low unemployment is a fantastic base from which to start. And people looking at this world from 1979 would have thought that achieving that level of employment was fantastic. And of course, many of the jobs, and increasing numbers of the jobs, are full-time jobs and the kind of jobs people want. Nevertheless, I very much agree with the point I think Diane Coyle made in your report. So what surprises me is how the forces of the technological digital revolution are all thought to be in the hands of the management. And what is striking is how the connectivity hasn't yet reached the workers.
And just before we leave that question of employment, you'll recognise the voice that said the Tories have been obsessing with number, not quality of jobs, that actually when you look at the actual quality, you find a miner who says things were better off 40 years ago.
Yes, I thought, if I may say so, I think that was a bit out of date, because as the labour market has got tighter in the last few years, one of the things that's noticeable is that increasing numbers of the extra jobs have been full-time jobs, and the good news as well is they've been spread very evenly across the country, if anything, slightly more in the poorest parts of Britain. So it has been progress. Nevertheless, the next stage is, in your three options at the end, disruption, harnessing technology to boost.
How do you respond to that?
I mean, you can't gloss over the actual realities of the labour market. So, you know, we at Class Think Tank, we go out and speak to workers, and we do a survey every year. And, you know, two-thirds of workers would tell us they can't make ends meet. We know that in-work poverty is growing. We know that there's a huge regional disparities. We know the number of people with zero-hour contracts. We know that the disparities, whether it be gender or race or class, still are in our labour market. And this is ultimately about power. And this is what Thatcher did so well. She concentrated power in the hands of management and the wealthy elite. And essentially what happened with deunionisation is that we saw this quite striking increase in inequality in this country. And what we have to do going forward, and in this new era with more automation, I should say, because it's already started, is that we need to redistribute that power again. We need to make sure people have a say.
You're not saying
in
the
the
answer
workplace.
is going back to the unions of the 70s?
No, I think unions, look...
Or are you? I mean, that's what I'm asking.
The idea of unions, the idea of people coming together, workers coming together, having a say, you know, electing representatives, democracy in the workplace is... You can't reinvent that wheel. That's, of course, so fundamental. If you look at other countries that are much better than us on mental health, on labour market outcomes, they have strong unions, they have strong collective bargaining. You know, we need more women, we need more people of colour to come through, of course. But the mechanisms are what works. Unions work.
Dan, you can hear this, or you can say the Conservatives have got to double down on what they do best, which is free market, which is liberating, if you like, the worker, rather than trying to play the same tune as Jeremy Corbyn's already offering. What do you do?
I mean, I think the whole premise, I don't want to sound churlish, but the whole premise of Ben Chu's film, I thought, was absurd. The reason that the country was ripe for revolution at the end of the 70s is that there had been a visible failure. That had been the era of double-digit inflation, constant strikes, the three-day week, prices and incomes policies. We were the slowest growing economy in Europe. We were an international catastrophe. And people understood that we needed to do something different, and we went from being the slowest to the fastest growing economy in Europe, and people's lives improved, especially...
But what he was doing
now,
was
that is not the case today. Today we have
you have
the
Sports
best...
Direct instead of the mine. So just take that exact example and respond to it. Is that an improvement?
So, actually, I think that an economy in which huge numbers of people were doing hard, brutal jobs underground is an economy that we are now falsely nostalgic about. Yes, I think...
It wasn't false nostalgia, was it? Sorry to interrupt, but just to pin you down, he was talking about what was involved in that contract. He got his housing, he got his medical care, he knew the hours he was working, he had stability, he could see the progress of a career. Many young people simply don't have that. They cannot see any trajectory of a career.
Take the whole package. Would you like to go back to life in the 70s with the whole... Because you can't just pick and choose and say, I'll have everything as it is. Well, because the reality is that it was the liberalisation of the economy that brought the huge improvements. Sorry, but I just want to make this one point. You can't look only at pay and not at the way in which prices have fallen, the way we now have cheap flights, the way we now have the internet. That is also a product of a market system.
You know, it's amazing to me that you can't see visibly how difficult it is for people right now. Every time I get on the tube, there's someone asking for money. Homelessness has gone up massively. The levels of people finding it difficult to find housing, even though that they're in work. Look, this isn't about that false dichotomy that is always set up of like going back to the 70s. No, we're looking forward, and we're saying there's certain things we can learn from the past, and the failure, because there has been a failure of Thatcherism and capitalism over the last 30 years. You know, you can't look at the financial crisis and look what's happened afterwards and say that we don't need to change.
David Willetts, is it the role of government, though, to be involved in that way that Pfizer's suggesting?
Yeah, I think there are some things governments can do. The question is where we go next. As to where we've got to so far, I am actually with Daniel. I think we have made great progress, but where do we go next? And I think there are still massive problems with people on low pay who are struggling to make ends meet. But the old trade unions, sadly, are not relevant for their problem. What we do at Resolution, we're sponsoring initiatives such as, for example, Labour Exchange, which is an online labour exchange where workers can set out the terms on which they wish to work and find jobs interactively online. We're supporting other online organisations like Organise, which enable workers in the gig economy to connect with each other and organise online. In other words, I think the future is disruption like that, where we will see many more ways in which workers in the gig economy can be stronger.
This isn't really about what governments do. The world that our children are going to inhabit is going to be unrecognised. You and I have kids of the same age. I don't think they're ever going to have a job, as we understood that word, in the 20th century. I think they're going to be constantly reskilling, constantly retraining, constantly freelancing.
But are they ever going to afford a house?
And the idea that the answer to that is more trade union power, more collective bargaining, just belongs to another century. I mean,
what this is ultimately about Thatcher's values, which is there's no such thing about a society anymore.
Finish the quote. If you're going to quote that, it's only fair to quote the whole thing.
It's about individualisation, right? And what unions are people standing together.
I don't believe you don't know the correct quote there. You're putting that out there in a slightly naughty way, because you know that what she was actually saying was people need to have direct responsibility for each other, right? If you're going to quote that little sliver, it's only fair to put it in context.
Unions are about people coming together and fighting together and saying, look, we need to balance the power in the workplace. The things that you talk about, as useful as they may be, they don't do that same job. And so don't think that the mechanisms of unions will look exactly the same as that. Of course, people have changed.
No, but the idea that we are a poorer society now than we were then is just palpably untrue. Yes. We are living better, working shorter hours, affording more things. No, people in general. In fact, people across the whole world are. And there is an extraordinary reluctance to see...
David, do you share that? When you look at the food banks in the country, do you share that view of conservatism?
OK, listen, food banks were invented 20 years ago, right? They didn't exist. The Trussell Trust had 2 food banks in 2004. So, of course, they have become more common for the same reason that smartphones have become more common. They didn't exist before. That is not a measure of poverty.
You saw the graph in Ben's piece, which is that more poor people are in work. They are working and they're poor. Can you answer that,
Are you saying that poverty is higher now? Is either of you saying that poverty is higher now than it was?
The truth is that real incomes are manifestly higher than they were 40 years ago. But that is the process of industrial progress we all expect. The question is what happens next? So it's no good engaging with your concerns by saying we're all better off than we were in 79. That is absolutely true, but that isn't where the politics is. People don't look back, they look forward. So the question is, as we go into the next election and as we go into the next Queen's Speech Map, what's the next thing we do? And my view there, for example, linking training to membership, to employment is strong. That's the kind of thing people want.
This is a very real... Can you try and explain to me very briefly why austerity, as it was, would have got voted back in 2015? I mean, why doesn't the radicalism of Jeremy Corbyn or, if you like, Ed Miliband seem to be winning elections?
I mean, look, one of the things that has been very well done alongside that inequality of power and income and wealth is a divisive narrative, is to say, well, those people that are poor are undeserving. And we heard a lot of that, right? Poverty porn. We've heard, every other headline in the Daily Mail for a period of time was that. We heard Osborne talk about curtains, right? About people not opening their curtains. We heard about immigrant bashing. So what we've done is that we have divided the working class. We have distracted them from what have ultimately been policies. We've distracted them with Brexit, for instance, right? So we've distracted them from ultimately what are domestic policies that have resulted in, rickets coming back, in children going to school hungry. My mother-in-law has worked as a dinner lady.
We're running out of time.
It's never been so bad.
Last word.
The plural of anecdote is not data, right? I'm sorry, the facts actually matter here. It doesn't...
Well, the facts
you can't invalidate facts that the incomes are rising, that people have better time, simply by saying, but here is one individual case. Well, there are fewer than there ever were.
The paradox is that actually, as people have become... the most important engagement you now have from government, you have more people whose income is determined by the minimum wage, a state intervention, than by collective bargaining.
We've run out of time. We have more films to come. Thank you very much indeed.